The Manson family case is one of the most famous true crime stories in American history, but this rabbit hole goes much deeper than you may know.
Failed musician and cult leader Charles Manson is one of the most infamous criminals of the 20th century, after ordering youths to commit a series of grisly murders in a futile attempt to provoke a race war. Like many of history's most deranged minds, Manson had a troubled upbringing and traumatic childhood that helped shape him into the monster he would eventually become. Much has been written about his life and actions as head of the Manson family, but little has been said about the woman who raised him, or at least the woman who occasionally attempted to. Kathleen Maddox was a 16-year-old runaway when she gave birth to baby Charles, though at the time his birth certificate was labeled no-name Maddox. Maddox herself reportedly had a rough childhood, frequently rebelling against the strict religious background of her family. She would often sneak out at night to go dancing, and it was at the dance halls where she met most of the men in her life. Charles's father was likely an older married colonel, but Maddox married a man named William Manson while still pregnant with the future cult leader. The marriage didn't last long, and Kathleen and Charles ended up bouncing around the houses of family members in an unstable living situation. When Charles was 6, his mother would help commit an unusual robbery that would land her in prison and change his life forever. In 1939, Kathleen and her brother Luther were both convicted of armed robbery and sent to prison. The Maddoxes weren't armed with firearms, though. In the commission of the robbery, Luther wielded an empty ketchup bottle. According to Oxygen, the siblings had been out on the town with Luther's girlfriend when they met a man they thought to be rich. They lured the man into a gas station, and Luther pressed a ketchup bottle filled with salt into the man's back, claiming it was a gun. When he didn't buy it, Manson's uncle smashed the bottle over the man's head and stole $35 from him, along with his car. Luther received a 10-year sentence and Kathleen received 5. While Kathleen would be released 3 years into her sentence, those were formative years for Charles Manson. The young mother would return to find her child already had a record of his own for theft and skipping school. Manson was brought up by his disciplinarian uncle, who reportedly made Charles go to school in a dress one day after crying on the car ride home. His uncle also forced Manson to visit his mother in the intimidating prison, against the boy's wishes, to further traumatize him.
And I used to visit her in the prison visiting room.
By the time Kathleen returned, Manson had become someone who could not be reined in or controlled by her limited parenting skills. She reportedly left Manson largely unattended while his mischief turned more sinister. Manson had already displayed manipulative tendencies as a child, and Maddox's arrest and hands-off attitude let those tendencies fester and grow. The ketchup bottle arrest was a one-off crime that Kathleen seems to have been mostly talked into by her brother. Contrary to several claims, including some from Manson himself, Kathleen never engaged in sex work. The lies told by Manson after his capture were attempts to elicit pity and find excuses for his behavior, although growing up in the Depression meant that Manson's childhood, though certainly tragic, was not uniquely so. Much of the sociopathic behavior that would allow Manson to lead his cult members to commit horrific crimes was developed during and immediately after his mother's imprisonment. At school, he would manipulate other students to attack children he didn't like, and refuse to claim any responsibility for his actions. He frightened his cousin by waving a sharp sickle at her, and she was sure that she would be killed until her uncle and aunt arrived. He also took up music at this point in his life, which would later help draw people into the Manson family. Sadly, after Kathleen Maddox's release, she was incapable of dealing with Manson and eventually tried to have the boy sent to boarding school. His crimes and manipulations continued as he moved around to different youth offender programs and juvenile detention centers. By the time he was imprisoned for the first time as an adult in 1956, the relationship between mother and son was essentially over. The world has held a strange fascination with Charles Manson ever since the inner workings of his family went public after a string of grisly murders, all of which were done not by him but at his behest. You probably already know that Helter Skelter was found written on the LaBianca's fridge in blood, though misspelled, and you've probably heard about Charles Manson's obsession with the Beatles. The whole story is ridiculously complicated, and Rolling Stone says Manson wasn't just obsessed with Helter Skelter, but the entire White Album. Manson believed the album was an ode to a coming race war that would destroy the country with its epic proportions. During the trial, Manson and his followers claimed they had interpreted the White Album with the help of the Book of Revelation, and it was especially powerful because it came on the heels of Magical Mystery Tour, which Manson believed documented his own hippie trip. Manson assigned most of the songs an apocalyptic meaning. Rocky Raccoon was a clear racial slur. Blackbird was a fight against the establishment and a call for revolution, and Piggies was mocking the establishment. In case you're not intimately familiar with the White Album, there are 2 other songs that don't need much in the way of explanation: Revolution 1 and Revolution 9. The Beatles have each individually expressed their horror at Manson's interpretation of the album, and George Harrison even condemned him for giving the scruffy, long-haired hippie look a bad connotation. It was John Lennon who put it best, though, simply saying, "He's barmy." Charles Manson preached Helter Skelter was coming, and when he said it, he meant it in a very literal sense. He, and in turn his followers, believed Helter Skelter was the name of a race war that would rip the country apart. The Miami Herald says he claimed white people would fight on two fronts, against each other and against black people. That schism would be the deciding factor, and Manson preached that only he and his followers would be safe during the revolution. They were destined to retreat to Death Valley and live in an underground compound until he was sought out by the champions of Helter Skelter. That was, Manson said, destined to be black people who would need to find a new ruler. You can probably guess who he thought that was going to be. He and his family were to be installed as the new leaders in a post-war world, and it was happening soon. He thought the Beatles were the harbingers of the end of days, and that meant it was time to find the bottomless pit where he and his select few would wait out the war. When the war didn't start, he decided to accelerate the schedule a bit by sending his followers out to start killing. Where on earth did Charles Manson get the basis for any of this? It was all rooted in his interpretation of the book of Revelation. If you're not familiar with chapter 9 of Revelation, that's the part of the Bible about opening the pit of the abyss, fire and brimstone, the horses of the apocalypse, and the reign of Abaddon, angel of the abyss. It's heavy stuff, whether you're a believer or not. Manson believed he was the fifth angel who held the keys to the abyss, and that he would unlock it to literally unleash hell on the world. He interpreted the entire section of the Bible to reflect his world, and of course, he was at the center of it. The locusts foretold to swarm the earth were the Beatles. The fire and brimstone was their music. The so-called armies of horsemen were motorcycle gangs, and the abyss itself was in Death Valley. All that was left was for him to unlock the abyss and bring about the end of days. Anyone who's asked to come up with a list of the most inoffensive groups in music history would almost certainly include the Beach Boys. But weirdly, in addition to their connection to Surf, Sand, and Kokomo, they're also connected to Charles Manson. Specifically, it's drummer Dennis Wilson who had the Manson connection, and it started when, according to the Washington Post, Wilson picked up a few hitchhikers. They were part of Manson's family and made introductions that led to Wilson crashing with the family to enjoy some girls and even more drugs. Manson even taught him how to play a bit of guitar. Wilson was already riding high on fame, and the Manson clan moved in with him, until a vicious STD made orgies not as much fun anymore, and Wilson apparently footed the bill to get everyone cleaned up. Wilson made the mistake of offering to help Manson with his dream of becoming a serious musician, but perhaps unsurprisingly, Manson didn't take well to the criticism that came with actually recording his music, and they parted ways. Charles Manson relentlessly insisted there was more to his relationship with the Beach Boys, though. He claimed Dennis Wilson took one of his songs, turned it into Never Learn Not to Love, and didn't even give him a writing credit. Manson repeated the claim in the documentary Truth and Lies, The Family Manson, and added at the time that he was so insanely angry about it he went as far as leaving a bullet on Wilson's bed. There was no violence, though. As Manson was holding out hope, Wilson would introduce him to producer Terry Melcher. It was a hope that would eventually lead to murder. It wasn't the only time Manson would claim the Beach Boys stole his music, either. Rolling Stone says Manson also swore he originally wrote In My Room as In My Cell, but the claim is absolutely impossible. Any manipulative killer achieves a certain amount of notoriety, but part of the reason Charles Manson's name is still high profile is because of victim Sharon Tate. The wife of Roman Polanski and an up-and-coming actress, she ultimately met her horrible end because they had picked the wrong house. After meeting up with Dennis Wilson and being promised a hookup to producer Terry Melcher, Manson continued to hold out hope his music career was going to take off. When it didn't, the BBC says Manson targeted Melcher and sent his loyal followers out to kill everyone they found in the producer's home. He had since moved out, and Polanski had moved in with his wife. Polanski was in Europe when 4 Manson family members broke into the house and started killing. Tate, who was due to give birth in a matter of days, died, along with friends Jay Sebring, Wojciech Frykowski, and Abigail Folger. No one would expect Charles Manson to be an angel behind bars, but according to the Los Angeles Times, he'd amassed somewhere around 100 rules violations by the beginning of 2017. What exactly does that mean? The violations included things like bizarre outbursts and behavior, throwing hot coffee on prison staff, starting fights, trying to start a flood, and trying to start fires. He was caught several times with drugs, illegal cell phones, weapons, including a hacksaw blade, and catalogs that led staff to believe he was trying to order hot air balloons in a completely insane plan to escape. His figurative middle finger to law enforcement started at his trial when he stood up, assumed the pose of Christ on the cross, and refused to sit down. Along the way, Charles Manson coined the term ATWA. It stood for Air, Trees, Water, Animals, and it was at the heart of the spiel he used to lure in some of the hippiest of hippies, even into the 21st century. It's no secret Manson had a weird way with the ladies. Afton Burton, who went by Star, the name Manson gave her, called herself Manson's wife and claimed everything about Helter Skelter, the murders, and the race war was absolute bunk. Instead, her Manson was a crusader for the preservation of everything that existed on the planet, ATWA. She told CNN, "Charlie never believed in something called Helter Skelter. He never thought any of that stuff. That's ridiculous. That's crazy. The only thing that he's trying to manipulate people into doing is planting trees and cleaning up the earth. He genuinely cares about that. He's nice to everyone. I've never seen him try to be manipulative. I've never seen any of that.
Somehow I've got half a brain that I can see that he is the one.
She wasn't the only one who followed him because of Atwah. CNN reported he continued to gain followers like Burton, who flocked to his idea of Atwah for years after he was tried, convicted, and imprisoned. Charles Manson will have been gone for decades before his figure stops being larger than life. When Eric Hedegaard interviewed him for Rolling Stone, Hedegaard also talked to Burton about what Manson was really like, behind the crazy. Burton said that 4 times a year she was allowed to send Manson a care package. And what did someone like Manson really hope to find when he opened that package? His favorites were pretty mundane. He loved sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, roasted peanuts, vegetable soup mix, crackers, cough drops, tea, and protein bars, along with socks, tank tops, and shorts. She also included guitar strings because playing the guitar remained one of his favorite hobbies. Charles Manson's delusions of grandeur didn't stop at claims he was going to be the head of a new world order. He had also convinced his followers he was Jesus. All he'd needed to do was to hint at the possibility, and his followers did the rest when they elevated him to a position of near divinity. They completely believed it, too. Manson hinted that he not only believed it, but that he believed in everything that went along with it. According to The Independent, Manson called off his imminent marriage to Afton Burton in 2015. After it emerged, she only wanted to marry him so she could put his body on display after his death. Apparently, he didn't think that was cool. Plus, he fully believed he was immortal. How'd that work out for him?
Notorious mass murderer Charles Manson passed away last November after serving nearly 50 years in a California prison.
At a glance, not much good came from Charles Manson's insane reign of terror. The Washington Post says there's a silver lining, though, and people can thank Sharon Tate's mother and sisters for it. After Tate's gruesome death, Mother Doris Tate appeared at family member Charles Watson's parole hearing, and she spoke. She was heard, too, and her words were the first victim impact statement in the state. Tate's family campaigned tirelessly for what became the Victims' Bill of Rights in California that ultimately led to all states passing laws allowing victims to speak out during trials and parole hearings. Later, Tate's sisters Patty and Deborah took up the crusade to fight for victims' rights and to keep Manson and his family behind bars. And that's huge. Manson may have wanted to bring about a race war and lead humankind into the next era, but his actions allowed a grieving family to pave the way for countless victims to have their voices heard throughout the justice system. That's something worth remembering.
Who were the other members of Manson's so-called family, and what happened to them after the cult finally fell apart? Sometimes referred to as Manson's right-hand man, Charles Tex Watson is believed to have been the only one with a gun on the night of the Tate LaBianca murders, thus making him the actual killer of at least 2 of the victims. In 1969, Watson was arrested and extradited to California. Although originally sentenced to death, his sentence was commuted to life in prison after California temporarily outlawed the death penalty in 1972. After his incarceration, Watson converted to Christianity and became a prison minister. It was through Bobby Beausoleil that Manson became aware of Gary Hinman, who was tortured and killed by the family over 3 days in July 1969. Beausoleil, who had been the one to finally kill Hinman, was caught just over a week later and convicted of murder. Bruce M. Davis played an active role in the torture of Gary Hinman, and a week later became a participant in the killing of Donald Shorty Shea. In the end, Davis was convicted for his role in both killings. Unlike the other members of the family, however, Davis has actually come very close to getting out. Thanks to a spotless disciplinary record, his parole board has recommended him for release, although each time the recommendation has been overturned by the incumbent governor of California. He remains in prison to this day. While Stephen Grogan wasn't involved in the Hinman or Tate LaBianca murders, he directly participated in the killing of Donald Shea. Later, Grogan cooperated with the authorities, even drawing them a map to Shea's body, and was released from prison in 1988. He has kept out of trouble ever since. Paul Watkins managed to get away from the Manson family without participating in any violence. Horrified by Manson's so-called helter-skelter vision of an apocalyptic race war, Watkins decided to get out of the family and went to the police after hearing about the Tate LaBianca killings. After suffering a mysterious attempt on his life, Watkins decided to testify in court. He later became a lecturer on cult psychology and substance abuse and died in 1990.
Charles Manson attracted a group of disaffected young people looking for a way of life different from their parents, with most of them being young women. Why did they buy into his madness? Here's a look at Charles Manson's girlfriends. By the time Manson met 23-year-old librarian Mary Bruner, he already had a long history of manipulating women. After his first marriage ended in divorce while he was in prison, Manson became a pimp and married one of his sex workers to prevent her from testifying against him. That marriage ended in divorce as well, again while he was in prison. Finally, in 1967, having spent more than half his life in prison, Manson was released and immediately used his charm to enthrall Bruner. In Vincent Bugliosi's Helter Skelter, the true story of the Manson murders, the late Los Angeles district attorney says that Manson associate Danny DiCarlo told him she was out walking her dog, high-button blouse, nose stuck up in the air, walking her little poodle, and Charlie's fresh out of the joint, and along he comes talking his Bruner soon quit her job and began following Manson as he recruited more women into his family. Implicated in the family's murder of music teacher Gary Hinman in 1969, Bruner was given immunity from prosecution for her testimony. In 1971, Bruner was arrested along with other members of the family for the armed robbery of a Western surplus store in Hawthorne, California that ended in a shootout with police. Sentenced to 20 years to life, Bruner was paroled in 1977 and disappeared from the public eye. The most notorious of Charles Manson's women, Susan Atkins directly participated in several of the Manson family murders, including that of Sharon Tate and her unborn child. According to Atkins herself, it was the culmination of a downward spiral that began in her childhood. She told 60 Minutes Australia, "I'm the child of 2 alcoholic parents. I'm a victim of incest. My mother died when I was 14. A runaway at 18, Atkins turned to crime and spent 3 months in prison for her participation in an armed robbery before meeting Manson. Sentenced to death for the Tate murders, Atkins instead served a life sentence when California abolished the death penalty in 1972. Atkins became a born-again Christian, denied a compassionate release. She died of brain cancer at the California Central Women's Facility at Chowchilla in 2009. Patricia Krenwinkel actively participated in both the Tate and LaBianca killings. Known to her cohorts in the Manson family as Katie, Krenwinkel grew up an overweight, insecure teen in Los Angeles. Suffering from an endocrine condition that caused her to have an overabundance of body hair, Krenwinkel was often subjected to bullying by her peers. Haunted by low self-esteem, Krenwinkel withdrew into herself and turned to religion for solace. After high school and following her parents' divorce, Krenwinkel moved to Alabama with her mother, where she taught catechism and considered becoming a nun. After a single semester at a Jesuit college, Krenwinkel dropped out and returned to California. She met Manson in September 1967. Preying on Krenwinkel's insecurities, Manson seemed to offer her the acceptance and love she desperately craved. In a 1993 interview, Krenwinkel recalled meeting Manson to Diane Sawyer. "That night, we slept together, and I felt really loved by him. He said, 'Oh, you're beautiful.' I couldn't believe that. I just started crying. He would look at you and smile, and somehow I felt like, oh, I'm a part of this." Krenwinkel, who stabbed coffee heiress Abigail Folger to death, has been repeatedly denied parole over the 50 years since her imprisonment.
Mostly the word that comes to mind is, what a coward that I found myself to be.
20-year-old Linda Kasabian had been at the Manson family's enclave at the Spahn Movie Ranch for just over a month when Charles Manson ordered her to drive Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel to 10050 Cielo Drive on the night of August 8, 1969. Manson's choice of Kasabian was purely utilitarian. She was the only member of the family with a valid driver's license, and a traffic violation was a legal hassle they couldn't afford. She would again take the wheel to ferry Manson and the group to the LaBianca's home the following night. Linda witnessed 2 of the murders at Cielo Drive and likely prevented the death of actor Saladin Nader the night the LaBiancas were murdered by intentionally directing Manson to the wrong address. Kasabian testified against Manson in exchange for immunity from prosecution and was instrumental in convicting the cult leader. At 28, Catherine Scher was the oldest female member of the family and Charles Manson's primary recruiter. According to former Los Angeles District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi, author of Helter Skelter, Cher was an ardent Manson devotee and a skilled liar who improbably attempted to implicate Linda Kasabian as the mastermind of the Tate LaBianca murders. Cher, who has spoken publicly and often about her role in the Manson family, also had the most unusual background of any of Manson's women. Born in Paris, France in 1942, her father was a Hungarian violinist and her mother was a German Jewish refugee. At the height of World War II, Cher's parents, both active members of the French underground, committed suicide. Cher was placed in an orphanage and adopted by an American couple at age 8. A talented musician, Cher was a virtuoso violinist from childhood and possessed a powerful singing voice. In 1965, she recorded a single titled Ain't It Babe for Autumn Records under the stage name Charity Shane. Cher also found work as an actress, taking bit parts in several movies. She met Manson follower Bobby Beausoleil on the set of Ramrodder, a Western-themed softcore porn film shot in Topanga Canyon. Beausoleil introduced Cher to Manson, and she instantly fell for the charismatic ex-con's freewheeling philosophy. Cher was wounded 3 times in the family's shootout with police following the attempted armed robbery of a Western surplus store in Hawthorne, California. The robbery and ensuing shootout landed Cher in prison for 3.5 years. Ruth Ann Morehouse was just 16 years old when she ran off with Charles Manson. Ironically, it was Morehouse's own father, Dean Morehouse, who introduced her to the cult leader. In 1967, Dean Morehouse picked up Manson, Mary Bruner, and Lynette Fromey hitchhiking and brought them to his home for a meal. Ruth Ann ended up running away with them. Although Ruth Ann was not involved with the Tate LaBianca murders, she bragged of her knowledge of the crimes, stating that she knew of at least 10 other killings. In 1970, she lured former family member Barbara Hoyt to Honolulu, Hawaii. In a bizarre attempt to keep Hoyt from testifying against Manson, Morehouse fed her a hamburger laced with 10 tabs of LSD. Hoyt recovered after a brief hospitalization and eventually took the stand against Manson. Morehouse was initially charged with attempted murder, but never did any time, and reportedly now lives anonymously with her husband somewhere in the Midwest. Only 14 when she met Charles Manson, Diane Lake was the youngest member of the family. Lake's parents were early adherents of the counterculture, who had dropped out of traditional society for a bohemian existence on hippie icon Wavy Gravy's hog farm commune. Lake left that home to join the Manson cult, which turned out to be a nightmare. Dubbed Snake by Manson, she suffered beatings and sexual assault at the hands of Manson and other members of the family. Lake's testimony would prove pivotal in putting Manson behind bars. Following a stay in a mental health facility, Lake was fostered by one of the detectives on the case and returned to school. Settling into an anonymous domestic life with her husband and children, Lake has spent the ensuing decades putting Manson behind her. But in 2017, she wrote a memoir of her experiences in the book titled Member of the Family. For Lake, writing about her time in the family was integral to her healing process. She told Newsweek, "People who have been victimized as children can carry that shame around like an awful weight as adults, and they don't have to. I also want my story to help parents with teenagers. You have to keep lines of communication open no matter what." A loyal follower of Charles Manson to this very day, Sandra Good improbably maintains that the late cult leader wasn't actually involved in the Tate LaBianca murders. Best remembered for brandishing a rifle and advocating violence in the 1973 documentary Manson, Good is the most outspoken of Manson's remaining disciples. Taking on the name Blue as an adherent of Manson's self-styled religious sect, the Order of the Rainbow, Good has spent much of her life as a militant defender of the environment. With fellow family member Red, aka Lynette Squeaky Fromey, which incidentally, it really is pronounced Fromey, not Fromm. The two founded the International People's Court of Retribution, a proposed terrorist group intent on killing the CEOs of companies that pollute the earth. As reported by the Sacramento Bee, Good and her associate Susan Murphy were sentenced to 15 years in prison for sending death threats to 170 people as part of her militant activism. Released after serving 10 years, the unrepentant Good continued to champion Manson and his psychotic philosophies.
Manson never killed anyone. It's just hard to explain. He's a very brilliant, wise being.
Like Sandra Good, Lynette "Squeaky" Fromey remains loyal to Charles Manson's ideals. The second of Manson's followers after Mary Bruner, Fromey did not take part in the Tate LaBianca slayings, but became notorious in her own right when she attempted to assassinate President Gerald Ford in 1975. Fromey brandished a loaded .45 caliber automatic and pulled the trigger, but there was no round in the chamber, so it didn't fire. Fromey was captured and served 34 years in prison for the assassination attempt. While in jail, she maintained a written correspondence with Manson before finally being paroled in 2009. In a 2019 interview with ABC News, Fromey maintained her admiration for Manson, saying, "I feel very honored to have met him, and I know how that sounds to people who think he's the epitome of evil. Was I in love with Charlie? Yeah. Oh yeah, I still am. I don't think you fall out of love." The last young woman to fall under Charles Manson's spell was Afton Burton. Renamed Star by the imprisoned cult leader, Burton nearly married Manson in 2014. Burton, 26 at the time of her engagement to the 80-year-old Manson, became infatuated with the notorious criminal at age 17. Fascinated by Manson's militant pro-ecology philosophies, Burton saved her earnings from working in a retirement home kitchen to move from Illinois to Corcoran, California to be closer to Manson, whom she would spend hours visiting in jail. Although a marriage license was issued for the couple in November 2014, the relationship ended when Manson was placed in solitary confinement. Some sources maintain that Manson declined to marry Burton when he learned that she planned to profit from displaying his corpse. Either way, they never married prior to his death in 2017.
On the second night of the Manson family's rampage across Los Angeles, Charles Manson and 5 of his followers, including a teenager named Leslie Van Houten, were looking for more victims. Van Houten had met Manson in the fall of 1968 through 2 of his followers who called him Christ-like. Van Houten, a 19-year-old former homecoming queen born and raised in Southern California, took part in the brutal murders of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca in their home in Los Feliz, an LA suburb. Like so many others, she had fallen under Manson's sway, so when he asked her if she would kill for him, she agreed. Later that night, Van Houten stabbed Rosemary LaBianca multiple times. Leslie Van Houten was born in Altadena, California in 1949 and had what seemed like a perfect middle-class upbringing. She participated in sports and was popular in high school. According to The Manson Women and Me, Van Houten recalled, "When I was in high school, one of my teachers said I was in so many extracurricular activities. My photo was on every page of the yearbook." But Van Houten's lighthearted early life came crashing down around her when her parents divorced, after which the model student began to rebel. Van Houten experimented with drugs and briefly ran away to San Francisco with her boyfriend when she was 17.
I seemed to want more living out of life than what was expected of young girls at that time.
When she returned pregnant, her mother forced her to have an illegal abortion. The turbulence she had experienced undoubtedly took its toll on Van Houten's mental health and left her vulnerable to coercion by a dangerous manipulator such as Manson.
I was an empty shell of a person that was filled up with Manson rhetoric.
According to Ed Sanders' The Family, in the summer of 1968, Van Houten began traveling around California, ensconcing herself in the hippie counterculture that had begun to bloom in the mid-1960s and reached its apex with 1967's Summer of Love. It was during this time that Van Houten grew close with Bobby Beausoleil and Catherine Gypsy Cher. Soon, the pair would introduce her to the man himself, who would direct her to commit murder for which she would spend half a century behind bars. Manson was a petty criminal and con man who used his charisma and romantic hippie image, as well as mind-altering drugs such as LSD, to convince young, disaffected people like Van Houten to become his sexual partners, followers, and servants. Van Houten was enraptured by Manson on their first meeting and was especially charmed by his guitar playing. Like other members of the so-called Manson family, Van Houten became convinced that Manson was a reincarnation of Jesus Christ, capable of miracles. She was soon living with the cult at an abandoned movie set called Spawn Ranch. At the ranch, Manson's preaching began to take on violent overtones, including his visions of a coming race war. According to Charles Manson, the man who murdered the 60s, Van Houten later recalled, "All we did was listen to the Beatles' White Album and read Revelations."
That next summer there would be this big revolution and that the chosen people would live in a hole in the middle of the desert.
While she didn't participate in the first night of the Manson murders, Van Houten was more than willing to go out on August 9th to target the LaBiancas. The couple was reportedly unknown to Manson's cult, and their home was targeted at random after some of its members had attended a nearby party. After Manson and Tex Watson tied up the LaBiancas, Manson ordered the women to kill them. Van Houten stabbed Rosemary 14 to 16 times, saying she felt but didn't know for sure that she had already died from bayonet wounds inflicted by Watson, according to court documents. After her arrest, she showed no remorse and told the police about her love for the Manson family. According to Helter Skelter, the true story of the Manson murders, she said at the time, "You couldn't meet a nicer group of people." However, decades on, Van Houten revealed herself to be a model prisoner. On Tuesday, June 11, 2023, she was finally granted parole after serving 53 years in prison.
Danny Trejo recounted to Page 6 a bizarre experience involving none other than Charles Manson. The story is undoubtedly strange, but once you hear it, you'll see it sort of fits Manson to a T. There is no denying that actor Danny Trejo has lived a rich and interesting life. Born in Echo Park, Los Angeles in 1944, Trejo became involved with drugs and crime at a young age. According to IMDb, he spent 11 years of his life in and out of jail on drug and armed robbery charges. However, while in prison, he took part in a 12-step program that helped him to overcome his addiction and turn his life around. And that eventually led to an acting career. If you don't know the full story, here's a quick version of it. Trejo was working as a drug counselor when he received an urgent call to help someone being tempted back into cocaine. It turns out that the person was on a movie set for the film Runaway Train. Trejo was invited to be an extra, as a convict. He took his shirt off, and a screenwriter immediately recognized his giant chest tattoo and remembered serving time with Trejo, and he knew him as a champion prison boxer. Trejo ended up boxing Eric Roberts in a scene, and the rest is history. It's been a crazy ride indeed, but it's about to get crazier. According to Page 6, in a strange twist of history, Trejo and Manson had stints that briefly overlapped in the Los Angeles County Jail in 1961. He recalled feeling sorry for Manson, who was a small guy, greasy, dirty, scrawny, and so poor he didn't have a belt, and instead used a piece of string to keep his pants up. Initially, Trejo thought of him as someone who needed protection. However, after a few days behind bars, Manson told Trejo and the other prisoners that he could get them high by using guided meditation. He then proceeded to hypnotize the group into feeling as though they were high on weed and heroin, and shockingly, it seemed to work. Trejo recalled, "By the time he described it hitting my bloodstream, I felt the warmth flowing through my body. If that white boy wasn't a career criminal, he could have been a professional hypnotist." Trejo's hypnotized story certainly puts a different spin on the entire case and shows how influential Manson could truly be.
Throughout his nearly 50 years behind bars, Charles Manson never showed any remorse or even admitted any guilt for his infamous crimes.
Maybe I should have killed 400 or 500 people, then I would have felt better.
Manson's final words to a documentary producer, James Buddy Day, who interviewed him at length during the killer's last year live, showed no contrition and were instead boastful.
I'm the most famous human being, not only that is alive, but the most famous human being that ever lived.
The killer's conversations with Day, included in the documentary Charles Manson: The Final Words, were his last recorded before he died in November 2017. The project started with a phone call. James Buddy Day was surprised to get a ring from Charles Manson himself. Day had written to Manson asking him for an interview, but had little faith that the killer would actually call him. Yet, here was Manson on the other side of the line. In his book, Hippie Cult Leader: The Last Words of Charles Manson, Day wrote, "What do you say to the most infamous mass murderer of all time if given the chance? I knew what I wanted. To hear Manson's story in his own words and to get his permission to make a documentary based on that story." Charles Manson downplayed his role as the leader of the so-called Manson family. In Manson's telling, it was the others at the ranch who acted on their own.
I never told anybody to do anything other than what they wanted to do.
As Day delved deeper into the story, he determined that the commune wasn't as hierarchical and the story wasn't as clear-cut as it had been previously presented. Day told Time magazine, "There's so many people involved in the Manson story, and not one of them can really say what happened. No one was making decisions for the whole group." While Day believes Manson's version of events is likely closer to the truth than the police and prosecutors' interpretation, he admits Manson was still responsible for the killings. Day went on, "I think there's no question Manson is culpable for those murders, if not all of them. The murders would not have happened without him." Manson's claim of innocence provides a jarring contrast to his bragging about fame, a statement that smacks of pride and may offer a truer glimpse into what made him tick.
he never heard you express remorse. Have you never felt it?
Remorse for what? You people have done everything in the world to me.
Not long after Charles Manson's final phone calls to James Buddy Day, the killer died at Bakersfield, California hospital at 8:13 p.m. on November 19, 2017 due to complications from colon cancer. While Manson's interview with Day may have been his last, a decade earlier he had made a similar boast about his fame to another researcher. He told criminologist Jack Levin in 2007, "I am the most famous person who ever lived." Levin agreed with him to a point. He told Northeastern Global News, "That's only a slight exaggeration. There are many great people who preceded Manson and were world-renowned, but didn't have the benefits of the mass media like Manson did." Levin believes there will never be another Manson. He went on to say, "He fit into the anti-establishment environment that prevailed during the 60s and 70s, and those days are gone. We could get another killer that influences young people, but it wouldn't look anything like Manson." Charles Manson built a family that carried out some of the most infamous murders of the 20th century. But what about his actual family? What happened to those who called Manson father for real?
Guilty. I wouldn't do anything that I felt guilty about.
Although Manson referred to his followers as his family, he actually married 2 women and fathered at least 3 children.
Charles Manson is part of my bloodline, and I don't have a choice. I have to live with that.
Manson married his first wife, Rosalie Jean Willis, in 1955. At the time, Manson was 20 years old and Willis was only 15. In 1956, Manson's first biological child, Charles Manson Jr., was born. Manson wasn't present for his son's birth. He was serving time in prison for auto theft. While Manson was incarcerated, Willis filed for divorce and remarried. Her new husband raised Charles Jr. as his own, and the boy eventually changed his name to Jay White. White went on to have 3 children, but he never overcame the knowledge of who his biological father was and what he'd done. White's son, Jason Freeman, said his family never discussed Manson and did everything in their power to downplay their association with him. Unfortunately, White and Freeman became estranged.
I just want to get to know my grandfather. And he tells me I don't know how to be a grandfather.
In Freeman's opinion, White wanted to spare him any backlash from being the grandson of the notorious serial killer. Freeman said his father was haunted by Manson's crimes and he just couldn't let it go. He couldn't live it down. He couldn't live down who his father was. Jay White died by suicide on June 29, 1993. He was 37 years old. He was laid to rest at Greenwood Cemetery in Hopedale, Ohio. Manson married his second wife, Leona Ray Candy Stevens, in 1959. In the months prior to their marriage, Manson faced a hefty prison sentence for forgery. However, Stevens pleaded for leniency, claiming she was pregnant with his child. Manson's 10-year sentence was ultimately suspended, and he and Stevens married shortly thereafter. Although she wasn't actually pregnant when she spoke at Manson's trial, Candy Stevens gave birth to a son on September 24, 1960. She named the boy Charles Luther Manson. But by the time his second son was born, Manson was once again incarcerated. Stevens divorced him in 1963, 4 years before his release. Following his release from prison in 1967, Manson began dating Mary Bruner, who became known as Mother Mary. Bruner gave birth to Manson's son on April 15, 1968. She named the boy Valentine Michael Manson and lovingly called him Pooh Bear. However, Bruner's parents applied for and were granted full custody of the child when he was 18 months old. Valentine's name was changed to Michael Bruner during the adoption process, and he was raised by his maternal grandparents in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Bruner's adoptive parents attempted to protect him from association with his biological father's highly publicized crimes. However, Bruner's schoolmates eventually found out, subjecting him to relentless bullying and even death threats.
Everybody has a little something in their history that they keep in the closet.
Manson wrote to his son on numerous occasions, but Bruner claimed he never read any of the letters, saying he wasn't interested in having any kind of relationship with his father. In 1993, Bruner granted an interview to KCBS News during which he claimed to have no memories of his life prior to his adoption. Although he never had any contact with Manson, and his biological mother was more like a sister when he was growing up, his own children now refer to her as their grandma. Following the interview, Bruner avoided media attention for decades. However, in 2019, he consented to another more in-depth interview with the Los Angeles Times. In this interview, Bruner admitted to researching Manson and claimed his father was misunderstood.
I think the public has been fed some untruths, and this whole thing has been blown out of proportion.
During the interview, Bruner said that he believes that the Tate LaBianca murders, for which Manson is most well known, may have happened in the midst of a botched drug deal. He also suggested the victims may have been involved in organized crime.